Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Global Security. We're here at the Parliament of Canada today to launch a new report on transnational repression in Canada, a threat to democracy and public safety. What we've seen across the world, democracies are targeted by authoritarian states, suppress diaspora groups, surveil diaspora groups, threaten their loved ones back home, and spy on fellow Canadians. And we're here to present this report, a detailed report on the subject of transnational repression in Canada, documenting which diaspora groups are targeted, which countries, most notably led by China and Russia, but others as well, that are engaging in a form of interference in Canadian society. One of the key things Canada led during the G7, its presidency led and made transnational repression one of the key aspects of foreign policy and collaborating with the G7. So it's coming from Canada's leadership of the G7 that we launched this report and ask for other countries, G7 member countries, to work with Canada, because this is a threat that's increasing. It's a threat that's becoming more pronounced. And in the United States, with the government change there, we've seen a cutting of funds to all the key organizations that study transnational repression, that could monitor what was happening, nefarious actions online, and looking at what authorities in these closed authoritarian states were targeting. So we've lost that ability to track and monitor transnational repression. We need to build up capacity. We need to have more funds coming to Canadian civil society groups to do the research that is no longer being done in Washington. So this is an opportunity for Canada with France, Germany, Italy, its other G7 partners, to make this both a foreign policy priority and a domestic priority. So with that being said, I just want to remind everyone that the Hague Commission came out last year and it stipulated that there is wide-scale foreign interference happening in Canada, but it also stipulated that transnational repression was one of the key issues that came out that she heard from Canadian diaspora groups, and it really, Justice Hague felt that it was one of the most underreported threats to Canadian democracy. So we're here today to present this report that's available on our website, migsinstitute.org, and to really give guidance to both government and civil society about what can be done and what's happening to diaspora groups across this country of ours. I would now like to turn to my colleague, Marie Lamensch, to give some comments as the author of the report, give some comments in French.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup. Je voulais vous parler un petit peu aujourd'hui des conséquences sur les victimes parce qu'on les a un peu entendues lors de la commission Hague, mais je voulais un petit peu voir personnellement comment ça les affecte. Donc premièrement, la répression transnationale a vraiment des conséquences physiques et par l'intimidation de violences physiques. Donc, par exemple, c'est le cas de l'Inde qu'on a vu au Canada, c'est une de ces conséquences. Ensuite, il y a vraiment les conséquences psychologiques. L'intimidation constante, aussi à travers les réseaux sociaux, amène un stress constant, une sorte de traumatisme, la peur que même au sein de sa maison, on n'est pas en sécurité. Toutes les activités aussi numériques malveillantes. C'est particulièrement vrai pour les femmes. Nous avons parlé à des femmes qui se font intimider par le gouvernement chinois à travers les réseaux sociaux. Donc, elles reçoivent des deepfakes, par exemple, de elles nues, alors que c'est des faux. Elles se font aussi menacer de viol à travers les réseaux sociaux. Ensuite, on a les menaces contre les proches qui se trouvent ici au Canada ou alors, par exemple, dans des pays d'origine. C'est le cas souvent de la Chine ou de la Russie, où les familles là-bas vont se faire intimider afin de forcer la personne qui est ici au Canada à rester silencieuse. Il y a aussi les menaces juridiques que l'on voit envers certaines personnes, c'est-à-dire qu'on va faire des poursuites judiciaires. La Russie est devenue experte dans ce domaine-là. On le voit aussi contre des Canadiens qui font des recherches sur ce sujet-là. Ensuite, il y a l'ostracisme communautaire. Donc, c'est-à-dire que vu que la communauté de la diaspora a peur elle-même de la répression transnationale, elles vont finalement repousser la victime en dehors de la communauté afin de se protéger elle-même. Donc, il va y avoir une conséquence d'isolement et d'isolation de la personne. Ça cause aussi beaucoup de tensions au niveau des groupes d'activistes. Et c'est comme ça qu'en fait, certains gouvernements vont s'attaquer à des groupes de manière constante, s'attaquer à leur page Internet, leur page Facebook, constamment attaquer ça afin de vraiment causer des tensions au sein des communautés activistes afin qu'elles se taisent. Ensuite, il faut vraiment comprendre que ça a des conséquences pour la démocratie canadienne et les institutions démocratiques. Ce qu'on a vraiment compris lors de la commission Hogg, c'est que beaucoup des personnes visées vont en fait arrêter de s'impliquer en politique parce qu'elles ont peur de toutes conséquences. Elles vont peut-être pas aller voter, elles ne vont pas prendre la voix sur la place publique. Et donc ça, pour nous, c'est vraiment la diaspora et ces membres-là sont venus ici pour être protégés, pour trouver un milieu sécuritaire, pour s'impliquer dans la démocratie. Et le fait qu'elles soient visées par des menaces venues de l'étranger, elles vont cesser de s'impliquer en politique. C'est le cas beaucoup qu'on a vu de la Russie. Donc je voulais vraiment mettre l'attention sur les victimes et aussi rappeler que maintenant on a appris durant ces quelques jours que les Canadiens auraient le droit d'aller en Chine sans visa du moment qu'il reste moins de 30 jours. Et il est important de faire en sorte que les Chinois qui viennent ici au Canada aient encore besoin d'un visa. Parce qu'une des choses importantes qui est revenue ces 2-3 dernières années, c'est les stations de police secrètes qui existent encore au Canada. Et beaucoup d'agents chinois sont venus ici pour intimider des personnes sur le sol canadien. Donc il est important qu'on garde quand même un œil sur les personnes de Chine qui viennent ici, afin qu'elles ne viennent pas intimider des membres de diaspora ici. Merci beaucoup.
Merci Marie. Et maintenant, now I'd like to invite MIGS's senior fellow, Phil Gurski, former CSIS and Public Safety of Canada official, and as co-author of the report, to make some comments.
Thanks, Kyle. Merci, Marie. As Kyle mentioned, I spent 32 years in intelligence here in Canada with CSIS and with the Communications Security Establishment. Now, while transnational repression and foreign interference is not something that I worked on, it was more counterterrorism, I'm well aware of the investigations that my former colleagues with those organizations are involved with to uncover the nature of TNR in Canada, the extent of it, the actors that are involved. And I think it's important to remember that when we think of TNR, we think of some, as Marie mentioned, some traditional actors, like the Chinese and like the Russians. When Marie and I were doing the research for our paper, we found out that it goes well beyond that. There is Algerian transnational repression here in Canada, whereby there are people from the Algerian diaspora, part of the Kabyle community, that are seeking some sort of independence or some kind of autonomy within Algeria, who are being pressured by the Algerian government not to say anything about it. And as we're speaking here in February of 2026, you've all been watching what's happening in Iran with the mass riots and the attempts to overthrow the regime. I've spoken to Iranian Canadians who regularly receive threats to not raise what's happening in Iran here in Canada, to not protest against the regime. And I think Marie did a great job of outlining the types of threats that these people face. Everything from online harassment, women are receiving sexual threats. And let's bear in mind that we've had assassination plots, one of which was successful here in Canada, out in British Columbia a couple of years ago, of a Sikh activist by agents of the Indian government. I have a former colleague, a very senior Saudi intelligence official I met many years ago, and a Saudi hit squad was sent to Canada in the late 2010s to assassinate him as well for things he was saying against the Saudi regime. Therefore, it's really important that, and as Maria and I write in the report, TNR is a widespread phenomenon, as Kyle has mentioned, through G7 leadership under Canada has pointed that out. Let's not narrow our focus on one or two nations. It goes right across the border. The next part, I guess, is what are we going to do about it? And as somebody who worked in intelligence, my simple recommendation is that we've got organizations that are looking into these threats. My former colleagues at CSIS look under transnational repression under Section 2B of the CSIS Act. So TNR is a subset of foreign interference. They're collecting intelligence. They're corroborating the intelligence. They are providing the intelligence to decision makers. And I think it's incumbent on the government to take that intelligence seriously. The Hogue inquiry pointed out quite starkly that a lot of intelligence on Chinese interference in our elections and through TNR was ignored for reasons I won't get into. So it's important that if we're going to deal with TNR, and as Kyle and Marie mentioned, this is a very sort of broadband approach to what to do about TNR. But at a minimum, the government has to remain informed on who the actors are, where they are, and what they're doing. Marie mentioned police stations. People, they go, oh, the police stations, that's yesterday's news. No, it's not yesterday's news because they're still here. And so we have the intelligence services, we have the RCMP that investigates under their own legislative mandate. So let's take the information that's being gathered by the professionals Let's ensure that it's being read, that it's being consumed, so that the actions that Canada and, in sharing with our G7 partners as well, can be as best informed as possible, so that the policies and actions that we can take are based on the best information and therefore the greatest possibility of success in preventing. You'll never eliminate TNR. You can certainly get to a point where you can minimize the effect of it, because as Marie said, diasporas are suffering. And we are a nation of diasporas. And we want to make sure that those diasporas feel that they can function, they can vote freely, they can voice their opinions freely, they can express their own views on their regimes back home without fear of any kind of violence to them or to their families. So the information is there. Let's do our best to use it. Thank you.
And in closing, I just want to emphasize that that this transnational repression, it's not going away. We have our esteemed colleague, the Honourable Irwin Cotler, former Attorney General of Canada Minister, who's still under 24-hour police protection since a couple of years now from threats from the Iranian regime. So even Canadians of high political status are susceptible of violence from foreign regimes operating in our democracy. So we must combine our capacity to do more with civil society, to expose some of these works, and to protect diaspora groups. One last point, the report can be seen in full on the website of our institute, www.migsinstitute.org. And we remain open to answer any questions if there are from people following online or in the audience. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Elizabeth Thompson, CBC News. You mentioned the question of the opening up between Canada and China and more travel and that. What are you specifically concerned about, and what should the government be doing to ensure that the people who come to Canada as tourists or as under whatever category aren't in fact people who are going to engage in transnational repression?
I'm sure my colleagues will have questions, or they have their own ideas on this. I would point and put forward is that as we undergo Canada this geopolitical shift, an unreliable U.S. ally that's threatening Canada economically and also our sovereignty, is that we also cannot be naive in dealing with the government of China. China has weaponized trade, it's thrown Canadians in jail, and we should not for a moment think that Canadian citizens traveling to China are not under threat of being monitored. We've had talks with Tibetan community who are always asked to spy on their fellow Tibetan community members here in Canada whenever they go to the Chinese embassy to get a visa. We're assuming that is continuing. But also there are many people entering the country who are not really international students or temporary workers that are engaging in transnational repression. So we have to keep our eyes open, and we can't close our eyes to the authoritarian threat that China represents and still is. As many of the countries around the world that deal with transnational repression will tell you that China is one of the biggest players, if not the biggest player. So that would be my comment. I don't know if Marie or Phil, if you have some comments?
Yeah, sure. I would simply state that within CSIS, there's the Security Screening Branch, which is the largest operational branch that CSIS has. And security screening is done on a variety of files, citizenship files, certain immigration files. CSIS has the resources, or it could always use more, but it has the mandate to do those types of things. So if there are visitors coming from the People's Republic of China, they should be vetted through CSIS. That has its own intelligence sources, has alliances with its counterparts around the world. And if CSIS comes up against information that indicates somebody is not being truthful or forthcoming in their background or their intentions on coming to Canada, they should be denied entry. I mean, there's no right to come to Canada. It is a privilege. And organizations like CSIS have the mandate to do the background checks on people to make sure they're not entering for purposes that are not consistent with what they claim. So a very simple answer to your question, ma'am, is that listen to what CSIS says when it says that somebody has a background that would make them ineligible to come to Canada.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I think keeping the foreign agent registry will be important. That's something we have seen in other countries that I think can be quite effective. But it's not just China. There is also one case that you mentioned in the report, which is Rwanda, which is often underlooked as a case because that happens through the physical stress from that, and the physical intimidation from Rwanda has been quite important as well. And that's often not a case that a lot of people look at.
Bonjour, Marie Chabot Johnson, Radio-Canada. Moi, je suis plus intéressée à savoir comment vous trouvez qu'en ce moment, le gouvernement se positionne par rapport à sa conscience justement de la répression transnationale, alors qu'il ouvre des canaux de communication avec la Chine, puis aussi avec l'Inde. Il va avoir bientôt un voyage en Inde. Qu'est-ce que le gouvernement fait de bien, mais aussi qu'est-ce qu'il fait de moins bien en ce moment?
Mais comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, c'est que la réalité, c'est que le Canada est coincé à un moment par les États-Unis qui met du pression sur notre économie. Alors, c'est certain, on a besoin d'avoir des nouveaux liens économiques avec des pays qui sont des grandes puissances, des grandes populations. Puis, il y a une opportunité pour la Chine, pour l'Inde, pour faire ça. Mais dans le rapport, on démontre aussi que ces deux pays ils ont une histoire de harceler nos citoyens sur le terre canadien. Alors, on doit être les yeux ouverts, on doit chercher des partenariats économiques, mais on ne doit pas se mettre dans des agréments qui pourraient mettre nos citoyens en danger. Alors, j'ai vu la semaine dernière, il y avait un groupe de diaspora chinoises ici au Canada qui ont écrit un lettre ouverte en disant qu'elles voulaient savoir c'est quoi le partenariat entre le Canada et la Chine sur la sécurité. Parce qu'ils avaient eu peur que peut-être il y aurait des données qui sont données à la Chine qui les mettront en danger. Alors, nous, ce qu'on dit dans le rapport, on doit être, n'importe qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec ces pays économiquement, c'est une chose, mais des autres enjeux, on doit vraiment faire attention pour ne pas mettre nos citoyens en danger.
Oui, je pense qu'il faut pas être dupe, il faut continuer. Bien sûr, on n'est pas naïf, on sait bien qu'il doit y avoir des liens économiques avec la Chine et l'Inde en ce moment-ci. Mais je pense qu'il faut toujours garder des barrières et élever plus de barrières pour prévenir la répression transnationale. C'est-à-dire continuer de faire de la recherche sur le sujet et surtout continuer d'aider les victimes. Parce qu'un des gros problèmes qu'il y avait avant avec la répression transnationale, c'est que les victimes allaient à la police, allaient à la GRC ou allaient aux différentes autorités et elles trouvaient finalement des portes closes parce que personne ne pouvait les aider. Donc c'est aussi faire en sorte que la GRC soit bien consciente des problèmes et que si une victime vient vers elle, elle trouve de l'aide finalement. Donc c'est vraiment continuer à faire de la recherche, être bien conscient des dangers et donc ne pas complètement baisser toutes les barrières et aider les victimes encore et toujours et les diasporas, leur montrer qu'elles sont en sécurité ici et que le gouvernement va continuer de faire de la recherche même tout en s'ouvrant à la Chine ou à l'Inde.
Tout brièvement, je suis d'accord avec Kyle qu'il faut expander nos économies à cause du fait ce qui se passe avec les États-Unis. Mais pour moi, et c'est noté plusieurs fois, le Canada, le gouvernement canadien, n'a pas une culture de renseignement, n'a pas une culture de sécurité. Tandis que nos alliés en Angleterre, en États-Unis, ils le font bien. Je dirais qu'il faut que le gouvernement canadien fasse cette culture, qu'il accepte des renseignements qui viennent des CRS, de GRC, de n'importe quoi, qu'il le mette lorsqu'il fait des décisions, il fait attention à ce que leur disent les agents de renseignement et de la police. Ça ne veut pas dire que c'est les renseignements qui vont décider la décision finale, mais il faut le mettre dans les considérations pour que les décisions soient les meilleures possibles.
Et si je peux ajouter seulement deux choses, je veux aussi dire que le gouvernement du Canada, ils ont fait deux choses très importantes dans les derniers 4-5 mois. Ils ont créé une académie de formation avec les pays membres du G7 qui était lancée à Toronto en octobre. Puis ils continuent de travailler avec les pays du G7 sur cette question, cet enjeu, cette menace à nos citoyens. Et deuxièmement, il y a aussi maintenant un secrétariat qui travaille dans le gouvernement pour coordonner tous les départements. Alors, il y a des bonnes choses qui se font en place à ce moment. Nous, qui sont dit dans le rapport qu'il y a des plus de choses qu'on pourra faire, puis aussi avec la société civile, puis avec les chercheurs, puis avec les journalistes. Merci.
This is a subject that has been looked at a lot in the past year or two. There's been a whole federal inquiry, and that what does your report bring to this debate that we don't already know? And why now? Just as the government has actually named a foreign influence commissioner and is getting the registry up and running, or at least has, published draft regulations.
Sure, I'll give some questions and I'll turn to my colleagues. So I think why this report is being done now is that it's partly because of the geopolitical situation that we're seeing. We're seeing countries, and it's not just Canada, looking to sign partnerships with China and others, which we want to highlight that poses some risk not on the economic side, but on the national security and human rights side. So that's part of why this report's coming out now. Two, Canada just handed over the G7 to France. So there's an opportunity to build on Canada's leadership that it held at the G7 on transnational repression, both online and offline. So those I think, are two key things that I would say. On the Hague Commission looked particularly at electoral interference. It didn't look at transnational repression. But one of the main comments made by diaspora groups was that this doesn't just happen. The foreign interference doesn't just happen during elections or during the election cycle. It's happening to many other communities, and transnational repression was one of the points or the components that Justice Hogue said shocked her, and realized that more has to be done and more has to be studied. So we thought it was important to put this out there right now to highlight that diaspora groups in Canada, as well as others that support these diaspora groups, are being targeted. And it's probably actually going to accelerate because of the U.S. Government that's cut all the funding to the key organizations that have studied and tracked this online and offline and shared it both through the Five Eyes and also with civil society partners. So there's a situation of opportunity for us to not let this fade, but to move it higher up the agenda.
I think it's important to underscore that this report began in 2024. The fact we're launching it today is for reasons that were beyond our control in many ways. I don't want to get into the details, it's not important. It's the only report that I'm aware of that gives a lot of actual details about TNR in Canada specifically. Been lots of reports on TNR as a phenomenon worldwide. And when you read the report, which is not very long, you'll get into actual concrete cases of individuals in Canada. In fact, one of our colleagues was going to join us today, but he wasn't able to make it. People who live here who actually have experienced, themselves, their families, have been threatened by transnational actors outside of Canada. So that, I think in that case, it's important to summarize that. And secondly, I think, in the final section of the report, we have some concrete recommendations on things that can be done. This is not a theoretical piece. This is a very concrete piece on what is happening, who's doing it, how it's happening, the impact, as Marie said, on diasporas, and most importantly, what do we need to do about it as Canadians? As I said earlier, we're very proud that we're a diaspora country. We're a multicultural country, but we have to protect the most vulnerable people in our country that are being subjected to these actions by people in their former regimes. They come to Canada for a safe life. They come here with their families to escape repression, to escape death in some cases, and yet they're faced with those same threats when they come here. So I think it's incumbent on us as a Canadian government and as Canadian citizens to identify this to the best of our abilities, and to therefore put forward, this is what we know, let's take action to stop it.
Is Mr. Tohti not here today because he felt that there was a threat?
No, he
Suggesting that one of your colleagues would be here in the context
we're not
of
actually
threatening.
aware why Mr. Tohti wasn't able to, whether it was a conflict in schedule, we're not sure, but we have nothing to suggest that he was under any, fear of appearing today.
He has been followed in the past.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other thing about the report is that a lot of the, countries that were mentioned in the media, in other reports, were very much about China, Russia, India, but we also mentioned Rwanda, Algeria. We could have gone into looking at Ethiopia as well, and smaller countries that are often overlooked. So this is a really global phenomenon, and we should also be aware, dig more into what's happening on university campuses, because we know it's happening, transnational repression is happening there as well. So there are a lot more to look into, and that's what we're doing at the moment as well. We're digging more into this. So I think, it's continue the research, continue helping the victims, because they want to be heard as well. For years, they were completely not listened to, and finally they got a bit of a chance to do so at the commission, but a lot more victims were not present at that commission and were not able to speak. So it's important to hear from them as well, and to continue to bring their experiences forward.
Sorry, I was going to make one last comment. Is just that right now, as Canada's unifying with the European Union in a strategic partnership, and with Germany and with France, those countries in the European Union are working, they see TNR as a threat to their democracies. And so Canada has an opportunity to collaborate with the European Union and European countries on this threat.
Vous avez parlé de garder les yeux ouverts. D'après vous, est-ce que ce gouvernement-ci a assez les yeux ouverts sur la question? Puis est-ce que c'est vraiment possible de pouvoir créer plus de liens économiques avec certains pays qui font justement de la répression transnationale sans augmenter le risque pour nos diasporas ici? Est-ce que c'est vraiment quelque chose qu'on peut faire?
Écoute, je pense, comme j'ai dit, que le gouvernement du Canada il y a une crise économique, puis elle a trouvé des marchés pour des marchandises, pour avoir plus de liens, plus de tourisme. Et tout ça, c'est bon. Mais qu'on doit faire attention qu'avec les pays autoritaires qui ont une histoire de harcèlement, qui respectent les droits internationaux, on a peur de Donald Trump parce qu'il fait des choses très mauvaises aux États-Unis, mais aussi la Chine, c'est pas, je dirais, le pays qui est le nouveau poster boy des droits de la personne autour du monde. Alors, on doit avoir les yeux ouverts. Je suis certain qu'il y a beaucoup de membres de ce gouvernement qui ont les yeux ouverts, puis on va continuer de discuter avec le gouvernement qu'est-ce que peut être fait pour protéger les Canadiens.
Est-ce qu'on peut vraiment ouvrir des liens économiques sans causer un risque d'augmenter la répression transnationale?
Moi, je pense que si on met les barrières en place quand même, et ne pas complètement mettre le dossier de côté, parce que c'est ça le risque aussi, c'est de même dans les coulisses continuer à garder un œil sur qu'est-ce qui est fait. On connaît bien les tactiques maintenant, mais voir aussi comment les tactiques évoluent, continuer d'étudier comment les tactiques de répression transnationale évoluent au fur et à mesure. C'est ne pas laisser rentrer n'importe qui ici afin qu'ils intimident les personnes au Canada. C'est l'histoire des agents de police qui viennent ici. Ça, c'est par exemple un exemple concret qu'on peut faire. Donc oui, je pense qu'on peut s'ouvrir, mais en étant bien clair même avec la Chine sur ce qui peut ou peut être pas fait et garder vraiment un œil sur le sujet.
Vous avez demandé si on a les yeux ouverts. Dans la commission de Hague, on a appris que le CRS avise le gouvernement depuis 40 ans que la Chine font quelque chose au Canada. Et on a appris que le gouvernement, des fois, ils ont fort attention aux renseignements. M. Carney, il dit que oui, c'est un problème, on va faire attention là-dessus. J'espère que oui, mais l'histoire au Canada n'est pas tellement bonne. Alors, comme j'ai dit auparavant, il faut créer cette culture de renseignement, cette culture de sécurité. Et si on fait ça, j'ai plus de confiance que oui, on va entrer dans ce domaine avec les yeux un peu plus ouverts.
Merci. C'est ce qui conclut cette conférence de presse. Thank you. This concludes the press conference.
Merci.